Good afternoon, and thanks for joining this briefing on the World Social Report, the annual UN flagship report on major social development issues. This year's edition is titled Social Development in Times of Converging Crises, a Call for Global Action. And we have two speakers with us today. We have Mr. Shantanu Mukherjee, the Director of UN DESA's Economic Analysis and Policy Division, and Ms. Wenyan, Chief of the Global Dialogue for Social Development Branch in the Division for Inclusive Social Development, also of UN DESA. So thanks very much for joining, and I'll hand over right to Mr. Mukherjee to walk us through the main findings of the report.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you for being here. I'm going to try and speed this up a little bit. So let me first of all invite you to peruse this report at your leisure at the website it's on. So this report is about the crises we've come through recently, and I want to make three big picture points. The first is about what are the losses to people and societies like during these converging crises that seem to happen together. The second, about expectations. What can we expect going forward? And the third is, what are some of the lessons and what can we do with it? So let me get into that right away and talk about the first main point of this report, which is that these crises can easily turn into long-term impacts on people, on social development, which is about poverty, employment, inclusion, inequality, and many other things, but we only look at a subset of those issues. So at the country level, you'll see on the slide on the left, we see this as a tale of lost opportunities with uphill trajectories going forward. There's been a $50 trillion global output loss between 2020 to 2030, and that output could have been well invested in social development, in poverty reduction, poverty eradication. And that's been uneven across country groupings. The biggest hits compared to where they were has been for LDCs, for SIDS, and developing countries. Now, the recoveries are happening, but they are uneven. And you can see on the right that inequality between countries, which was on a steady but slow downward trend, really spiked in 2020 and hasn't come back since. And that's important because inequality between countries is really an indicator of the fact that poorer countries are not being able to catch up in the way they should. So these turn into real impacts on people living in poverty. It's country level information, but you can see easily that in countries which are not growing fast enough, debt servicing gets really high. And so we have the situation right now where on average in IDA eligible countries, which is countries that get concessional finance from the bank, the total debt servicing is higher than the combined public spending on health, education, and infrastructure. Now, at the level of people, rather than countries, we see similar patterns. On the left is a slide about the increase in poverty levels during the crisis. What's interesting to note, though, is these levels have started falling in many countries, but not in the low-income ones, where they still remain elevated above pre-pandemic levels. And on the right, you'll see a comparison of employment changes in 2023 relative to 2019. And you'll see that in least developed countries and in low-income countries, unemployment remains higher than pre-pandemic levels, although for the world as a whole, it has actually fallen. So it's just a sign of how persistent these impacts are if you're already poor and you're already living in a poor country compared to living somewhere else. And there are many channels, and this report explains them all, on how this turns into lifelong impacts. I just want to show you one, which is on the left, on the graphic here, which shows number of weeks of school closures on the y-axis, so higher is more, relative to the average learning attainment or years in schooling on the right axis. And you can see that exactly where the learning is on average less, kids have spent more time out of school. And you can understand, I think it's all over everywhere now, the implications of not being in school in formative years. You can see how this translates into really long-term impacts. Overall, then, what I want to take away from here is that there are different channels through which there are long-term impacts, and short-term losses can easily turn into long-lasting ones. You're disproportionately worse off if you're already disadvantaged. And what we learned through this crisis is that when you have crises at these major scales, at global scales, one has to be prepared that there'll be unexpected things. Inflation was something people didn't expect, and it came and hit people hard, especially the poorest. And also when countries try to take corrective action, the implications of their actions spill across boundaries. We've, I think, discussed in this presentation, in this room, and in other places, how the implications of rising interest rates to control inflation in large economies has spilled over into adverse impacts into poorer economies. So what's going to happen now? What should we expect? Well, there are different bodies that look at different kinds of expectations about other shocks. I'm just going to speak about the climate shock. And on top, the chart is showing the CO2 concentration in parts per million over time. The reason this is, and it goes all the way up to now, the reason this is an important chart for us is that now it's tending to enter that zone above which that 1.5 degrees Celsius rise will be happening. So this is a really dangerous period here, and we see that with climate change on this scale, the chances of shocks happening simultaneously go up, and the bar graph shows what is the likelihood of a joint shock to food production in different parts of the world. And that is a telling hazard for us because food production tends to be concentrated in terms of export in just a handful of countries. So this is just to make the point that although the pandemic has now subsided, although the global inflationary shock also seems to be down, although there are many indicators saying that things are turning around, we should be prepared for other shocks. And so the question becomes, are we so prepared? The left bar chart is showing an index of international health regulation that is kind of preparedness to respond to health emergencies. Blue is 2015, orange is 2023, and you can see that actually in 2023 we are worse off than we were in 2015. And on the right is the coverage of social protection by at least one benefit, not even how large is the benefit. And you can see that in rich countries, about 85% of the population is covered, and in poor countries, it's flipped around, 85% is uncovered. So are we ready for when the next shock hits? The answer seems to be no. Should we be doing something about it? Definitely. And is this a good time? Yes, because right now, I mean, you know, the time to prepare for a shock is not when you're in it, but when you're a little bit out of the woods. So economic growth has been improving, not to the extent we'd like. Other conditions like inflation and so on have been subsiding. So our report really is that let's take the most of this opportunity while it's here. And we have a number of recommendations here, the 10 action areas. I'm not going to go over all of them. But I'm just going to say that our main takeaway point is that national and global action really needs to support each other. So if you're talking about expanding social protection and poverty reduction through human rights approaches, human rights-based approaches, through different design of programs, that's typically national policy. But that can't really take off unless there are international agreements on freeing up what countries can spend by helping relieving them of debt burdens. And so we look at all the actions possible by looking at the convergence between global and national and how they can support each other. And I think then this also seems to be, in a sense, an opportune time because the Pact for the Future has just been decided. The outcomes are expected quite ambitiously from the Financing for Development Forum and the World Social Summit. And we think that some of the information we are putting out here might help move us towards those outcomes, besides also energizing people who work in these areas to kind of put their backs to it and make the most of it, most of this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Ms. Yang?
Yes, thank you, Martina. Thank you, Shantanu. I want to pick up where Shantanu left, that he highlighted the needs for national and international efforts to support each other. And now is a good time to actually try to build consensus and commit to actions. In this context, you know that member states have decided to hold a World Social Summit under the title of Second World Summit for Social Development in the fall of 2025 in Qatar. And this summit is coming after the Summit of the Future and the forthcoming Financing for Development Conference. So this summit showed, I quote, give momentum towards the implementation of the 2030 agenda, as this is the ambition of member states. Shantanu had also mentioned the recently adopted Pact for the Future. This pact outlines the summit, the social summit's broad contours. In Action 6 of the pact, member states have stated their intention to secure an ambitious outcome at the summit to accelerate the implementation of 2030 agenda. They particularly stress the need to invest in people. The first reason to invest in people is to end poverty. And today is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. I think it's a good opportunity to emphasize this imperative. And the second rationale for investing in people is to strengthen trust and social cohesion. And trust and social cohesion are emerging as priorities in the international development agenda in order to tackle the challenges of poverty, inequality, and climate change that Shantanu had mentioned. In preparation for the World Social Summit, the next edition of the World Social Report that's going to be released in 2025 will examine trends in trust and challenges related to social cohesion around the world. And this report, the upcoming issue of the report, will also survey challenges in addressing the goals that have been on the international development agenda since the first World Social Summit for Social Development, the World Summit for Social Development in 1995, that is poverty eradication, full employment and decent work, and the reduction of inequality, including through social inclusion. I can tell you that, to just whet your appetites a little bit, I can tell you that a preliminary message of the upcoming edition of the World Social Report is that although the world has achieved unprecedented progress in some areas of social development in the last decades, however, people are feeling increasingly insecure and uncertain about the future. For instance, almost 60% of people surveyed are worried about losing their jobs or about not finding a new job. As a result, they are losing trust in their governments. 56% of the world's population has little or no trust in their government. So the upcoming report is taking the message that current crises are negatively affecting the capacity of governments to tackle poverty and inequality that Shantanu has shared, one step further to ask that what can we do? And also the social report in 2025 foresees that the scale and complexity of global challenges is outpacing the ability of existing policies and institutions to respond to those challenges, which this further undermine people's sense of security and their trust in government. So just to conclude, I just want to share that growing insecurity together with high inequality and persistent social exclusion are corroding the social fabric and thus the ability of countries and of the international community to act collectively towards common goals, including achieving the SDGs to address climate challenges. So the second World Summit for Social Development is an opportunity to build new global consensus on social policies and actions to create momentum for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and to fulfill the promises that we made to people in 1995. So I will just end here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you both. Thanks for this overview. Any questions for the speakers? Yep. Can you please identify yourself?
Sure. My name is Vusala from Azerbaijan News Agency Report. My question is about actually climate change issues. Azerbaijan is preparing for to be host COP29. I'm just wondering, are you working with the Azerbaijani government in order to evaluate the economic impact of climate change in national and international level, or do you have any comment on that?
Thank you. As you're aware, the COP negotiations are hosted by UNFCCC. So that is where that discussion actually takes place. From DESA's side, we have had for the last 6 COPs shared space at each conference which connects climate action to the SDGs. And we think this is important for everybody to understand that this is actually a joint agenda. And also, as Wenyan and others have noted, a lot of the things that are in the SDGs, like poverty eradication, improvement of the lives of women, employment generation, these are very close to people's lives. While sometimes it may seem that climate change or climate action is happening far away and we can't do much about it, certainly we can do things about that are close to us. And we do them in ways that help climate action and vice versa. So, for example, in our report, we say that in countries that are trying to meet their nationally determined contributions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if you're a country without too much industry, then chances are you're doing this through improving carbon sinks, so through more afforestation, improving the quality of your forests and so on. And we say that this is a huge contribution that's being made to the world, but it also needs to be made in a way so that the people whose livelihoods depend on these forested areas are not then having to find other sources of employment can move forward. So we identify opportunities in this report by which the climate action or other big global agendas on which everyone has signed up can also be pathways for achieving the more down-to-earth goals that affect people's lives on a daily basis. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. Noreen Hussain with IPS News. If I just want to touch on in one of the points that you mentioned about preparedness and how amongst, but preparedness is still rather poor amongst other countries. I wondered if you could please expand on that, like why that is still the case, even amidst the crises that we've gone through and even, in a post-COVID pandemic world.
I mean, there are many layers to this answer, and not every kind of action is in bad shape. So if we look at one kind of crisis, which we discuss in the report, but I haven't spoken about here, it's about things like the global financial crisis, when financial institutions kind of completely melt down. And we think that one of the things that happened after the last financial crisis was much better regulation of banks and much better understanding of how these crises could spread. And this may have actually helped in the recent past prevent some of these occurrences happening again. Of course, I mean, one hopes that one will never be proven wrong on these things. So some of these actions are in place, and these are actions that affect all of us. On the other hand, if you look at what I put up there in terms of social protection, where I said the coverage of even one guaranteed benefit is just at about 15% in low-income countries, so 85% of the population has no access to it. There are different reasons for this. First of all, I think, in most countries, governments' priorities are actually to reduce poverty and improve people's lives. It's just that in order to do so, they need to achieve a particular level of growth. So often it becomes a question of which is going to come first. So what we are saying in this report that actually this is kind of too narrow-minded a view, that you can invest in people in order to get higher growth in the future because you're improving resilience, you're improving their capacity to actually contribute to growth in the future. And there are a multitude of reasons why this kind of thing happens, one of which is limited resources. Another one is that sometimes modern advances in technology, simple modern advances in technology, like being able to make payments through your cell phone, are not fully captured. So then you're stuck with making payments through other mechanisms which are not so efficient, and you lose a lot of money. Or people are not sufficiently empowered to sign up, which is why we have spoken about improving the human rights-based approach to these things. So there are concrete ways forward. We do need that money resources to be available. And perhaps one of the ways in which it can be made available when debt burdens are taken care of is to make the taking away or the easing of debt restrictions somewhat conditional on what governments do in return in terms of investing in people.
And to what Shantanu has said, I just also want to add a more positive message. That is, things are happening, and we do, I think, collectively and countries individually have taken lessons from the say COVID pandemic. That we've seen that countries where they have social protection measures in place and they really geared up, scaled up, through the social protection measures to respond to the needs of people in terms of income support and protection of jobs. And also, this is I'm just not just saying just try to be positive, but actually this is what the ILO, their latest report on social protection. World Social Protection Reports has shown that 4 or 5 years ago, when they issued their first comprehensive report on social protection, there are about 4 billion people in the world who have no social protection whatsoever, not a single measure, no matter how minimal. Now, the second time they issued their second report, now they are saying that 3.8 billion people don't have any coverage of social protection. What this implies is there are 200 million people globally have gained access to some measure of social protection. So I also want to share this, positive message of hope that we actually can do something, and there's a lot to be done. But we had to get down to get international agreements and national consensus to actually take action to scale up progress in many areas. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick follow-up? Mr. Mukherjee, just want to touch on your point when you said that one of the measures that we could take towards ensuring money is more made readily available is by easing debt restrictions on countries. And I imagine that would be perhaps most relevant and most pertinent for developing countries and least developing countries that are saddled with debt. What can you expound on that, or can you just tell us about how feasible that is, or has that been how feasible that can be, or have there been any sort of challenges posed to that?
So this taking care of highly indebted countries' debt actually has happened in the past, perhaps around the year 2000 or so. So definitely it can be done. And right now there are conversations among the main creditors of countries on how to make it happen. And we've seen some positive developments in a few countries. But the condition is also now a lot more challenging than it was earlier, because there are the number of lenders has increased a lot. So it's no longer a conversation between, let's say, the World Bank or other international development banks and the country on how to resolve the debt. Now you have a lot of other lenders, and you also have borrowings from the private sector, because countries are able to raise funds in the international market, which all have to be paid back. Now, you can imagine that when there are a lot of people who've lent money, no one wants to be the first person to say, okay, I'll withdraw my claim for a little bit until things get better, because then everybody else will say, country X is taking a little bit of time. Why don't you repay us because country X is standing back? So these kind of coordination mechanisms and good kind of agreement platforms were set up, and I think they need to be revitalized. A big part of the Secretary General's call for the SDG stimulus actually centers on how to make this kind of debt resolution much better. One is not talking of writing off debt, because that varies from country to country, and one can't prescribe that across the board. But one is talking about creating enough space for countries to invest in their own growth, so that when they do in the future actually take debt, they're actually able to pay it back. Otherwise, it's kind of like a vicious cycle. Thank you.
I think we'll close here. Thank you very much. Thanks all.